So, I'm Terry Harrison. I'm a professor in the Supply Chain and Information Systems Department here at Smeal. I'm also the former faculty director of sustainability for Smeal. It is my delightful pleasure to welcome you to this talk. I'm looking forward to it. This talk is sponsored jointly by the Sustainability Institute, the Department of Psychology, and the Smeal College of Business. So, I have written down, because Michael is such an accomplished person, I can't trust my memory to give this introduction fully, so let me just read it to you. Today's speaker, Michael Vandenbergh, is the David Daniels Allen Distinguished Chair of Law and the Director of the Climate Change Research Network and co-director of the Energy, Environment, and Land Use Program. He's a leading scholar in environmental and energy law, whose research explores the relationship between formal legal regulation and informal social regulation of individual and corporate behavior. He works with Vanderbilt's Climate Change Research Network. His work with it involves interdisciplinary teams that focus on the reduction of carbon emissions from the individual and household sector. His corporate work explores private environmental governance and the influence of social norms on firm behavior, and the ways in which private contracting can enhance or undermine public governance. Before joining Vanderbilt's law faculty, Professor Vandenbergh was a partner at a national law firm in Washington, D.C. He served as Chief of Staff of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency from 1993 to 1995. In addition to directing Vanderbilt's Climate Change Research Network, Professor Vandenbergh serves as co-director of the law school's Energy, Environment, and Land Use Program. So now you can appreciate why I needed some notes with that introduction. Please, with me, welcome our speaker, Michael Vandenbergh.
Thank you very much. It's an absolute privilege to be here. I have a really deep connection to State College and to Penn State, and it begins with me at birth, literally. I was born at Bellefonte Hospital, which no longer exists, because my father had a collection of starlings where he got his PhD. Wasn't it under the football stadium that he kept them?
Playhouse now.
That wasn't a trick question. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. In any event, he kept birds here and studied animal behavior and got his PhD here. My brother is now a professor of biobehavioral genetics. And my sister-in-law works in sustainability at the university too, and I appreciate all your efforts here. And then Janet Swim is somebody I'm a huge fan of, who's just a major figure in a lot of the areas I'm going to be talking about today. And we've collaborated on different things over time and all that. And so I think of Penn State as just ground zero for a lot of the best work being done in this area. And I want to pursue the supply chain expertise that you have as well, because I think that's an area of opportunity in the future that I'm just getting into. So what I'd like to do, again, I'm a lawyer. I'm not a psychologist, I'm not an economist, I don't even play them on TV, but I got into this field because I felt as though the disciplinary boundaries between fields were an absolute barrier to insight. And as a lawyer, I don't care what discipline you're in, I don't care if you have a PhD. I'm used to being the one who doesn't know the facts, but asks the hard questions to try to get there. It's easier for me if I have you under a subpoena or something like that, but it's okay even in another setting. I've also, having been the EPA Chief of Staff, I've been literally yelled at by members of Congress and senators. So if you have an objection along the way, please raise it. I'm happy to have you object to whatever I do. If you are, whether you're liberal or conservative, if you're not both intrigued and a little bit discomfited from what I say, then you probably didn't hear what I was saying. Because what I'm doing is something I think a little different from what you might have heard elsewhere. So I encourage you to jump in along the way. Very happy to take your questions, and also I'll stop along the way. And I'm going to try to cut myself off as we go forward here. I'm setting my timer for myself. Will you let me know when I'm getting close? Okay, so let's start with this. And I apologize, a couple of you were at the talk I gave at the law school earlier today, so you're not allowed to raise your hand here. But let me know what you all think. Who recently said this. They announced a goal to eliminate 20 million metric tons of greenhouse gas emissions. Yeah, okay. So you guys know too much, and you probably know that but not because you read my book, right? No, because it's where the introduction is in the book. But now you know that you don't have to read the first paragraph of the introduction after you buy the book. So the book that I have, by the way, is with Jonathan Gilligan, who's a physicist at Vanderbilt and kind of a polymath. And so it's a collaboration we've put together over the last 8 to 10 years. And in fact, that's right. This is Walmart, right? I should have known coming to Penn State that you would know that. And more recently, they announced a target of 1 billion tons of carbon emissions by 2030. How much is 20 million metric tons? Well, what they actually achieved was in the 27 to 28 million range. Why should we be somewhat confident that they actually did that and this wasn't just greenwashing? Well, they made that announcement with the Environmental Defense Fund, which has a full-time staffer in Bentonville working with Walmart. And the EDF is a non-governmental organization that doesn't have an incentive in helping Walmart engage in greenwashing. How much would that be? That would be equal to the U.S. iron and steel industry being cut in half in terms of its carbon emissions. So if you're wondering, does it matter or not, if I were at EPA right now, how likely is it that I would be regulating the iron and steel industry to a 50% reduction in emissions of greenhouse gases? And then 1 billion tons by 2030, if they reach that. That announcement was made with the Environmental Defense Fund and the World Wildlife Fund, and that would be like one of the 5 or 8 largest countries in the world shutting down all of its emissions. So, you can decide for yourself if this matters. Now, that's the corporate side. What about the household side? Here's a phenomenon I think many of us in this room, there are many experts in this room who know some of these areas far better than I do, but this is from 1990 to 2015, per capita household electricity consumption, and even a lawyer can figure out what this means. For the first time in our lifetimes, everyone living in this room, the household consumption of electricity on a per capita basis has leveled off and is starting to go down. All right, and why is that true? Well, because in 2009, right here, I published a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences recommending that we do this. And boom, yeah, so I'm feeling pretty, and don't worry about the causality there. I'm just going to make that assertion. More seriously, there is an economist, Lucas Davis, who just recently published this paper where this chart comes from, that suggests that might be fully attributable to households taking up LED lights. That alone might be the reason why this is occurring. And what makes this, I think, even more interesting is that who's been pushing LED light bulbs in a big way? Yeah, Walmart, right? What did they do? We didn't have cheap light bulbs. They said to the industry, and again, I'm not trying to praise or dislike Walmart one way or the other here, but it shows you the interaction of corporations and households as it relates to carbon emissions. They said to the industry, if you give us a $9 or less LED light bulb, we'll sell it. And so people had a real incentive to go do that, and then they pushed those out the door. We could have lots of conversations about why Walmart might do that, but that phenomenon is striking. Why does it matter here? Because the U.S. household share of carbon emissions is equal to all the emissions from every country from South America. Right? So when this curve occurs, that's a remarkable thing in terms of the global carbon emissions footprint. Okay, so here's the LED argument by Lucas Davis. He doesn't account for my paper in here, so I'm not going to dwell on this one. But he makes the argument that you can explain that just by LEDs. So what I want to do is I want to talk about a couple of phenomena that we discuss in the book. And the first is how we frame the climate problem and efforts to frame the climate problem, and whether we're focusing too much on the problem and not enough on the solution when we frame climate problems, if our goal is to induce people to be thinking more seriously and more accurately about the state of the climate threat. And then I want to talk, because this is an audience, I think, of social scientists, right? Business students, business professors, environmental professionals. You're not, any lawyers? Yes, okay. Help me out then if I get in trouble. So what I want to do then is talk a little bit about what the things that we say in the book. I'm not just going to walk through the book, but the things that we say in the book that I hope that you might find interesting, either as an identification of a barrier or potentially a research opportunity, a place we might put some effort. And I want to talk about conceptual barriers in this area, corporate motivations, what we know about them, what I think we need to know about them, how and why we might take households more seriously than we do, what I think of as spillover effects, and then climate justice. And then at the end, if we have time, I have several others that I'm finding really intriguing, but are more outliers. Okay, so in the book we make 2 key points. The first one, if you are studying climate issues and you're in the social science area, much of the action right now, I think appropriately, is in focusing about how do we better describe the problem, because the vast majority of the American population is not seriously enough concerned about the problem to want to do something about it. And that, by the way, is unlike what's happening in Latin America and the Caribbean. Right? There was just a poll that was done at Vanderbilt, actually, from an organization called LAPOP, which shows that beliefs in the U.S. about climate are deeply different from the rest of the Western Hemisphere, interestingly enough. So what people are doing, and again, I think it's smart to do this, is asking if we make the problem more vivid, if we make it more immediate, if we talk more about justice issues, if we redescribe it in some way that draws on the best social and behavioral science, then maybe people will begin to align their views with the consensus view of the actual climate scientists. And our view is that that's not the only way to do this, and maybe not even the best way to do this. That we need to think equally about what people anticipate the solution to be. Because we think that the best research suggests that, that people are anticipating what the solution is going to be, and that it's not about framing the problem, it's about thinking about the solution. And I'll talk to you more about that. The second thing we say in the book is that we believe the private sector can give us 1 billion tons a year of carbon emissions reductions over the next decade. And we don't believe that will solve the problem, but we believe that that will help narrow what we call the Paris gap, which is the gap between the emissions reductions that will be achieved if every country fulfills every one of its voluntary, contingent and non-contingent commitments in Paris versus the pathway that we need to be on to have a 2C future. So we don't think that we can solve the problem with private action whatsoever, but we think we can buy time, reduce risk that will pass thresholds, and reduce the net mitigation costs along the way. So that's what I'm going to try to convince you of. And if you'd already read the book, you'd already be convinced. I wouldn't have to talk. But okay, so the first problem we run into is a framing problem about what the options are out there. And this is a slide from Michael Gerard, who's at Columbia Law School, who directs their climate center. And this is the way lawyers think about what the potential responses are to social problems, particularly environmental problems. And I like to think about this as, here's the stack of all the regulations from the IRS. This is the tax code, right? And here's the environmental code. And as we like to say in environmental law classes, we're number 1, right? But most other people think that's a really horrible thing, because look at the size of the environmental regulatory code, right? And that epitomizes how we conceptualize what environmental law is. It's government promulgating stringent regulations that direct the behavior of largely corporate emitters. And that's what environmental law is. That's what I was taught as environmental law. It was taught as a subfield of administrative law, which is a subfield of public law more generally. And if that's true, then we care about what the statutory basis is, because the regulations can only be promulgated to the extent there is statutory authority. But if you do that, you see an issue, right? Every one of the little asterisks up there is a major federal pollution control statute, okay? And it's not that I just forgot to do the asterisks to the right of 1990, right? There should be one probably now. I need to go in and add one for 2016 because the Toxic Substances Control Act was actually amended, and we could talk about that if someone has a question about that, because I think that proves my point. But notice what happened. Almost 24 major pollution control statutes, Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, the Superfund statute, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, et cetera, passed up to 1990, and then nothing, right? No major, and this is true whether what you wanted to do was scale back environmental law or expand it, right? The machinery shut down. There were some small ones, but nothing that I would call major, and I think most environmental lawyers would agree with me on that. So what happened there? Well, here are the LCV, the League of Conservation voter scores. This is from Aaron McWright's work at Michigan State. League of Conservation voter scores for members of the House and members of the Senate from 1970 to the present. The top lines are the Democrats, and the bottom lines are the Republicans. And what you see is some difference, but not a great difference leading up to about 1991, 92, maybe 93. And then a huge gap that has just continued to open over time. So a low score means that your vote can be predicted that you'll vote against an environmental bill, and a high score that you'll vote in favor of environmental statutes. And so what happened there, right? What we see is this yawning gap of polarization. And again, I hate to personalize this too much, but one other answer is I became the EPA Chief of Staff right about there. And so in my own megalomaniacal world, I think I'm the cause of this problem. But anyway, we need a little humor when we're thinking about climate change. So what's happening here? Well, if you're Congress, you've got this huge polarization going on. But interestingly, if you're running a business or a university or a nonprofit group, these are various different measures over time of public support for environmental protection in the U.S. And you see it bouncing around a lot, and a little bit of a downturn in prioritization given to environmental protection, the dotted line at the end there. But as a general rule, though it bounces around, you don't see some phenomenon where public concern for the environment goes off the cliff. So you have this contrast. You have deep polarization, but you have support for environmental protection running roughly even throughout this period. So what does that mean for all of us? Well, my suggestion is that what's happened is that the machinery of federal action, with the exception of some regulatory action on environmental protection, right, is no longer the only game in town. Right? As that machinery has ground largely to a halt, what has happened instead is that businesses, faced with the pressure that's generated by that kind of background public support for environmental protection and other issues, have begun stepping up, working with environmental groups in some cases. So my argument for you, and the argument we make in the book, is that the actor now is not just government, but also private organizations. Not that private organizations have displaced government doesn't matter, et cetera, but that now when we're talking about environmental protection, it's insufficient to talk about government as the only actor out there, and that the action then has gone from laws, policies, and programs to private initiatives of various forms. And I find the term initiative awkward, but we'll talk more about vocabulary in just a minute. So why do I think that's true? Well, here's an example. Anybody bought a Filet-O-Fish from McDonald's lately? I did on my way up here, by the way. I do that. So why do I do that? I'm an environmentalist. Like, am I kind of making a countercultural step? No. You know what I'm doing when I do that? I'm buying a fish that was caught from a fishery that has to be sustainable according to the Marine Stewardship Council. So that's a private organization, not a government, that was formed when fisheries efforts at the international level failed. And it's the combination of the World Wildlife Fund and Unilever, which was at the time the largest seller of fresh fish in the world, joining together to form a private standard that certifies the sustainability of fisheries. I'm not going to tell you that I'm sure that every fishery was sustainable, or even the one where I had the Filet-O-Fish, but I can tell you that 15% of the fish caught for human consumption, 10% of the fish caught for human consumption around the globe are caught pursuant to the Marine Stewardship Council certification rules. So 10% of all the fish caught for human consumption are, if they are sustainable, it might be because they're subject to a private standard formed by the combination of a corporation and an environmental group. If you buy lumber from many different lumber outfits, it'll be FSC certified, and the FSC certifies about 15% of all the lumber coming from temperate forests in the world. A lobbyist in D.C. recently said that Target and Walmart are now the leading regulators of toxics in the United States. Why is that? Our toxics regulatory regime has been in gridlock largely since 1976, with some movement a year and a half ago. But what's happening now is Target and Walmart have their own toxic standards. So the head of the American College of Environmental Lawyers told me at a conference a year ago, he represents a major clothing manufacturer. When they are trying to decide what dyes and inks and chemicals they can use in making the clothes, the first thing they do is figure out what will Walmart and Target buy. And Walmart and Target are setting standards based on interacting with environmental groups to figure out what toxics are permissible from their perspective. Okay? And then they go look to see what the federal government does. Now, again, those are not immediate, they're not completely independent. The European standards drive the private standards as well. Federal standards affect them. But the leading regulators right now, according to one lobbyist in D.C., of toxics in the U.S. is Target and Walmart and their private standards. I did a study a while back now of environmental supply chains. The paper is called The New Walmart Effect, and it was originally called The Walmart Effect, and then I heard a week before I was going to publish the paper that someone was publishing a book called The Walmart Effect. So I just stuck the word new in the title, and now it's called The New Walmart Effect. The New Walmart Effect paper says, if you look at the 10 largest firms by sales in 8 leading global sectors, what you find is that more than half of all the firms in every one of those sectors is imposing environmental requirements in their supply chain contracts, even though there's no legal requirement to do that. Okay? We didn't study whether they were efficacious or not, but we did study their presence. And what I want to talk about more today, and what we talk about in the book, is the role of these kinds of approaches in climate change. So when it comes to climate change, I started working in this field assuming that people proceeded as to whether or not they thought climate was a problem and whether they should do something about it in a pretty rational way. You go out and gather data, you analyze the data, you decide whether it's happening or not, and then you decide how much it's worth doing something about. What I've learned instead from watching what's happened, from reading the literature, and from our own work, is that we're really talking about human beings functioning starting with a set of worldviews, a view about an ideology, it's called a lot of different things, and then engaging in confirmation bias and motivated reasoning. So we start with a worldview, and then we go out and we get the facts that we want to hear. And this is not just a conservative phenomenon, it's a liberal and a conservative phenomenon. We get the facts we want to hear, we throw out the ones that are inconsistent with our worldview, and the more facts we get, the more we reinforce our view. Okay? And again, that's something we're all doing all the time, but it's particularly acute in the climate area. Confirmation bias has been called the best established phenomenon in social psychology or something like that. Janet would know for sure what that citation is. But this is happening with all of us. And so, I live in the South, right? So this particular slide is of particular relevance to me. Between 3/4 and 2/3 of the American population, when asked, says that the biggest threat facing America is big government, including half of all Democrats. Okay? So if people in their minds are associating climate change with a big government response, and if 2/3 to 3/4 of them think that climate change is going to invoke big government and they follow this view, then we wouldn't be surprised that they would engage in rejection of the underlying problem. And in fact, if you look at the work of Campbell and Kay, 2 Duke psychologists, what they would argue is that when, for example, Republicans are told that the climate response or solution is more government regulation, they go back and revise their view about the likelihood that humans are causing climate change in the first place. Not just whether or not they support the policy response, but they literally go back and are less certain that it's a problem in the first place. They call that solution aversion. So does that just occur as to a policy matter? Grommet and others have studied this notion, and what they find is that Republicans will not buy a light bulb, even if it will save them money, if it has a green label on it. Right? So it gives you a sense, again, and this comes out because it's climate on a Republican versus Democrat and left-right thing, but similar phenomena are likely to be occurring in other areas. It's not just a conservative phenomenon. But for us, we care about this because it means that if you're green labeling something, part of the potential population that's getting the green label is going to not buy it affirmatively, even if it's going to save them money. So we then looked at what the IPCC, the group of climate scientists that publishes a report roughly every 4 years or so on the essentially consensus view of the scientists, what have they concluded about whether humans are causing climate change? That's the green line that you see here. It started, we think balance of evidence means that 50% from a lawyer's perspective. The most recent, it's gone up every year, every report, is 95 to 100% are extremely likely that humans are causing climate change. What effect has this successive set of massive scientific reports, much of it funded by government, what effect has that had on Democrats? Very little. Right? Very little change has occurred. That's the blue line here over this time in terms of Democrats who would answer a similar question in the same way. And in fact, fewer Republicans than when this process was early on would make the same point. Right? So more and more government information is having limited effect on Democrats. 3/4 now think that anthropogenic climate change is happening. About a quarter say no, and fewer and fewer. Fewer and fewer Republicans are saying that over time. Now these data are a couple years out of date, so they're not exactly on point, but they're close enough for our purposes. Okay, so in our book, what do? Right? We say let's not just keep trying to figure out how to better explain the climate problem and convince people that it's serious, because we don't think that's how people think. We're saying much of the resistance to climate change is not about the severity or the intensity or the timing of the climate problem. It's about a concern that in believing that the climate problem exists, I have to then believe in a remedy that I think is worse than any other problem that I face, which is big government. Okay? And so what we suggest is that it might be possible to bypass the solution aversion problem with private sector responses to climate change. We don't think this will solve the problem, and we never argue that it will. You'll never see anything about that, but we say that we can buy time. We think a gigaton a year of CO2 emissions reductions, 1 billion tons a year, can close what we call the Paris gap, and I'll show you a slide on that in just a moment. We then lay out a model. Those of you who are modelers will be horrified. I'm a lawyer. My colleague's a physicist. He can actually do a real model. But this isn't a model in the sense of a formal model. It's a set of explanations that help us understand why it might be plausible that companies and households would be motivated to reduce carbon emissions. And in a genuflection to the non-economists, I use the word motivate rather than incentivize, because I think human behavior is affected by a lot of things other than incentives. But we produce a model, and we talk about both self-interest and other motivations. And we focus, and I'll focus here on corporations, and we also focus on households. But we think those are only 2 of the potential private sector respondents in this area. So let me anticipate a problem first, and then say a word or 2 more about the model. You might say, yeah, but what about states and localities, right? Even when I first wrote this book, and I have a bunch of papers that preceded this book on a similar topic, the answer I got over and over again from people who were more moderate to liberal was, yes, but government's going to do this, so why are you wasting your time on this, okay? And I don't get that question anymore. Because the federal government's not going to do this in the near term, okay? But now the question I get from the same audience is, well, aren't states doing this? And the answer is, yeah, many of them are, right? But those states represent just over 1/3 of U.S. carbon emissions. 1/3, right? So 2/3 of the states are not interested in engaging in reducing carbon emissions. So if your answer is state action is the answer, my answer is yes, for 1/3 of U.S. carbon emissions, they may be able to make a difference. But that leaves out 2/3. Why does that matter for me in particular? I live in the U.S. Southeast. The 7 southeastern states would be the 6th or 7th largest country in the world if they were a country, just in terms of their CO2 emissions. None of them are trying to reduce carbon emissions. In fact, they were litigating against the Clean Power Plan when the Obama administration was there, and now they're litigating in support of the withdrawal of the Clean Power Plan, which would have reduced state carbon emissions. There are a number of cities that have acted, and they're doing quite a bit. And so I think both the cities and the states that represent about 1/3 of U.S. carbon emissions are going to make a real contribution. But what we're looking for in this book is a way to deal with both the solution aversion problem and the fact that we're probably not going to get enough emissions reductions to substantially reduce the risk of catastrophic climate change. So we're looking at private action, not just non-federal action. Let's talk about a couple of potential barriers here. And the first that I always get, I take from an article that was written in Foreign Affairs magazine, and a very top global analyst of climate problems said the big problem with climate change is what can government do? And I would say no, right? That is embedding that approach to environmental regulation that I showed you the slides about in the first instance. The big question about climate change is what can any institution do? Right? And if we start with what can government do, then the question is what's the international process going to produce? But what does international mean? It means between nation states. A global supply chain, like the one that Walmart's going to try to get 1 billion tons of emissions reductions down, isn't between nation states. It's companies interacting with each other, right, without regard to the nation state. working around the laws, et cetera, right? But so I use the term global rather than international. People often ask, well, what's a policymaker going to think about this? The challenge with that is in the area we're working in here, the policymaker might be the head of a civic organization. It might be the Rotary Club president in a town. It might be the CFO of a company. It might be an NGO activist who's trying to change household carbon emissions. It might be the head of a private university. So the word policymaker is also not a complete fit. And we use terms like law, regulation, policy, and program, none of which easily fit into this area. So I tend to use the term initiative. I know it sounds a little bit clunky, but we just don't have the vocabulary, I think, necessary to avoid assuming that we're always talking about government. The other thing I would say, do we have any political scientists in the room? So I can really, anyway. So there's a really good book on this by Jessica Green, who's looked at the Carbon Disclosure Project and others, and it's called sort of the private authority response to climate change. In effect, I'm paraphrasing the title. But here's the issue, right? If you're a political scientist, you're thinking about authority because, again, you tend to be starting with government. And the question is, what entity can exercise authority over another entity? But in law, we know that, law and government change behavior not just by coercing behavior, but by providing or withholding resources as well. And doing that is not necessarily an exercise of authority. So from my perspective, here's another area where the vocabulary can box us into thinking about government. A lot about what I'll be talking about, it has nothing to do with one party exercising authority over another. It's subsidizing or changing the motivations of another party without the exercise of some kind of authority. So the first problem is, from a conceptual level, we ask what can government do, and then we get locked into language that reinforces that notion. The next one is, and I'm sure anybody here think that my example about the MSC and the filet-o fish was a problematic? Yeah. So what's the origin of that concern?
So happened to have assigned a book in my class this week written by Sylvia Earle.
Mm-hmm.
So just the awareness of how unsustainable a lot of fishing practices currently are.
Right.
The fact that we're promoting products at different levels on kind of the trophic ladder.
Yep.
So some of those issues, you could have a MSC certified can of tuna, and you'd still be up on that ladder, and
Yep.
there'd be some ethic against maybe harvesting fish at that level.
That's right, and there's been some really good, there was a piece in Science that essentially was saying some of the MSC certifications of some fisheries, they're certified as sustainable, and yet you're still maybe wiping out the sea lion population, and et cetera, right? And so there's a lot of critique of that. And so my view as a former policymaker and a former partner in a law firm is that that all makes sense, but that what we fail to do in the academy, that you have to do if you're thinking serious about climate change, is always ask as compared to what, right? So what is the realistic alternative that there will be a global compact that will produce a better standard that will better protect the sustainability of fisheries? I don't know the answer to that, but I can tell you, having worked at the highest levels of the federal government, pretty unlikely, right? And so for me, it doesn't mean that we want to necessarily accept the MSC standard as perfect, but we always want to be asking as compared to what, from my perspective, if we care about the climate problem, because the climate problem has a short tail in terms of the amount of time we have in order to deal with it. So we want to be asking as compared to what, and do we think there would be a better standard that would emerge from the public process? That doesn't mean we shouldn't try to improve the private standard or try to get the public standard, but it does mean we should also worry about spillover effects, which I'm going to get to in a little bit. In other words, did the private standard displace the public? So the other thing I would suggest here that's a conceptual barrier to progress in this area is that people tend to treat private responses to a variety of different environmental problems in a simplistic and kind of globular way. In other words, how many of you have seen a top 10 list of things that you can do in a popular magazine as it relates to the environment? Has anybody not seen that? Right? I have too. Look at those lists and ask yourself, is that the way we would regulate if we were regulating power plants? If we were regulating nuclear reactors, if we were regulating coal fire? No, right? We wouldn't pick the top things that we could think of. We would do something like what we recommend in the book, which is first ask, what's the technical potential? So for example, for every ton of aluminum that you recycle, there's a huge reduction in energy use and carbon emissions. Every ton of glass, not so much, right? So if I changed my behavior as to a particular thing, whether it's recycling or something else, what's the total carbon emissions reductions that would occur if all of it changed? Then the second one is what we call behavioral plasticity. So how many of you carpooled here? Fantastic, yeah, my brother and sister-in-law, you know. So, blow my example. So, but even, you know, the exception proves the rule. And that's about right. About 15% of the American population, at most, would even say they might carpool. And the actual numbers are in the low single digits who actually do, right? So carpooling is amazingly strong on technical potential because every time you put two people in one car, you cut the net emissions by half, in effect. But nobody wants to do it for the most part. So it has low behavioral plasticity. Then the third, and this is the one where I think we really advance the most new work in this book, is even if we have high technical potential and high behavioral plasticity, if it's a policy change that no one will do, like a new international standard for fisheries, right, which is not in the works, then the policy plasticity is low. And this is something many of us, and particularly the social scientists in this room, tend to downplay. Right? Economists talk about a carbon tax over and over and over again. Look at every one of those papers and ask, was there a question asked about when the carbon tax might possibly be feasible? And if we delay it by 10 or 20 years, whether it's still the optimal response. If you're a social psychologist, this is something I think Janet has gotten into, you know, how many psychologists are targeting those behaviors where it seems most likely that if they get a good finding, there's going to be some initiative that could get put in place to change that behavior? How many sociologists do that? So what we're trying to do is get people, if you're going to focus on private governance, don't just do it with top 10 lists, but let's be analytically rigorous. Yes?
So, I have a little pushback there.
Sure, yeah.
So in State College, if you sit down and calculate it, carpooling versus not carpooling, it makes an effect, but not a very big effect. If you avoid one trip to a conference, you blow away all of that effect. Mm-hmm. In places where it makes a difference, like I know my nephew works at the Pentagon, and one time I was surprised he was talking about he was going to be a slug that day. I didn't know what a slug was.
Right, yeah.
And but as he explained it to me, and we dropped him off, there are many people. Slugs, by the way, are people who just show up, don't talk, just get in a car and ride into the Pentagon.
And when they get together, they form a slug line. It's called, yeah, like a conga line. Yeah.
Giving folks enough credit for thinking through and making some rational choices at the individual level where, in fact, these things are happening.
Yeah. So I'm a fan of doing that. I would say that many of the colleagues that I work with don't go through enough of a rigorous process. I try, for almost every time that I'm invited to give a talk, I typically push back and say, can I do it by video or not? And the typical answer is no. But so I would say absolutely that part of what we're trying to do is to say we're targeting the philanthropists and the advocacy groups and the organization managers to say, in part, give people the information necessary because they very often will make the best choice. Not always, but very often if they're given that chance. But let me get to myths in a little bit because I want to show you, if I could, some information about how much people don't know about these issues. And let me just say one other thing for all of you in this room. If you are in the business of, even if you're a pure climate scientist, you've probably seen this research. I think it was done by some of the folks at Columbia and then University of Indiana, but it shows that if people hear that a climate scientist has a high personal carbon footprint, so they're not actually doing what their science would suggest, they will discount the climate science. Right? So if you are a climate scientist and you're flying around doing the thing that everyone got on Al Gore about, right? Your house isn't efficient and you're flying all over the place, you may be undermining literally the willingness of people to believe the very important stuff that you do. People have a real sensitive spot on hypocrisy, and so be aware of that. Okay, so, but here's an example. Once we shift from what can what can government do to what can any institution do, how might we deal with this problem of worldview and belief on climate? One answer is that we might, if we allow a private entity to do so, we might create a private climate prediction market, right? Where you and I could buy and sell the likelihood that the climate science prediction is correct as to global average temperature in 2025 or sea level in 2030 or whatever it might be. Okay? Not something you could expect government to do, but if you believe in free markets, then you should want to put your money where your mouth is. And even though that contract won't mature for 5 or 10 years, the price of it being traded between now and then will signal the likelihood that people think it will pay off in the future. And that will allow us to change public debates about climate change. And I can simply say, all right, if you don't think it's happening, fine. Sell me a prediction about the 2025 global average temperature, and let's trade it. You can buy one right now in New Zealand. This is in New Zealand. And a company was just formed in the UK. So you could do this in the UK as well. We couldn't do it here in the US because the CFTC and the SEC look down on this. They view this as gambling, and they don't see the asset behind the trade. And so what you could do in the U.S. is a private academic market like the Iowa presidential election market, if anybody has seen that, right? Does a pretty good job generally at predicting presidential and other elections. We could do the same thing here. We just need someone who's willing to step up maybe to business school and say, let's figure out how to do that, an experimental market as to climate. I've essentially implying through everything I'm saying that I think that if we had a private response to climate change that would avoid the solution aversion problem. I don't have an answer on that, just some preliminary work we've been doing. We did some studies. We asked people about their support for private versus public approaches to climate responses. And we did find as a general rule that political conservatives and moderates were more likely to state that we should be reducing carbon emissions when they thought that the response was private governance approaches, but this is still preliminary. It's not published data yet, and I'm working on a second round of surveys on this topic. But we have at least an early indication that our instinct might be right, that a private response will collect more support from moderates and conservatives. So again, my point on all this was not to say that we're going to solve the problem. This is the global carbon emissions. The very top line here is what will happen if we do not implement the Paris Agreement. The next line down is what will happen if only the non-contingent commitments in the Paris Agreement, that is when a country says we'll do it no matter what, if all those are implemented, and these are ranges of potential outcomes in the future because my co-author is a physicist, lawyers don't do that, but that's the range of potential outcomes. The next line down is if all the countries also that said that they had a contingency, that we'll do this if this other country pays us to do it or something like that, if all the commitments are made, then we get that next line. The bottom line, with the uncertainty on either side, is the pathway we would need to be on, most likely, to have a 2C future. Nothing magic about a 2C future, that is 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial temperatures, but widely thought to reduce the risk of a catastrophic future and to reduce mitigation costs. So there is a gap between them, and that gap varies, obviously, and that gap is between 30 and 90 billion tons over a 10-year period. And what we're suggesting is the private sector can cut that gap down by 10 billion tons. So somewhere between a third and 10 or 15% of the gap between where the Paris Agreement's going to give us if everyone complies and where we would want to be if what we're trying to do is achieve a 2C future. So why do we think this is plausible? Just look at what's going on out there without us stimulating it, obviously. Nearly half of the Fortune 500 companies have set climate targets of some sort. More than 400 companies, probably reaching 500 to 600 now, have an internal carbon price. So if you're at Microsoft or some other company, you're having to account for the carbon emissions of the activities of your business unit, and those activities are priced to you in corporate decision making. More than 100 companies have committed to achieve 100% renewable power, and more than 65 companies have signed on to a set of principles that, if complied with, will reduce by 48 million megawatt hours the demand for non-renewable energy by 2020, et cetera, et cetera. This is particularly important, again, in my part of the country, where the states are not pushing for carbon emissions reductions. I gave a talk at UVA just several weeks ago, and the week before I gave the talk, Facebook came into Virginia and reached an agreement with Dominion Power to provide $1 billion of a data center, but only if it was 100% fueled by renewable power. Okay? And so what you're seeing is the private marketplace pushing even in those states where others are not. So opportunities for research in the future. What we talk about in the book is that there are a broader range of drivers of corporate behavior than we typically talk about. At least I teach a law and business class with an economist at our business school, and certainly in law school. In law school, we think about the roles in the black on the left there of the drivers of corporate behavior when it relates to environmental issues as lobbying to reduce government regulation, or trying to shape government regulations so it's advantageous, or trying to raise rivals' costs. Those are three common features. There may be some others I'd be happy to hear about. And what we're trying to say is we think that that billion tons is possible in part, half of which would come from corporations, because companies also want to gain the financial advantages of accelerating efficiency. So if you're an efficient markets advocate, we're not arguing that these wouldn't be efficiencies that wouldn't be achieved at some point in the future. But from a climate perspective, if we can accelerate efficiencies, that's an advantage from a climate perspective. They may want to assure supply. Walmart has said that one of the reasons they have gotten in the sustainable fishery business is they're big enough they can wipe out entire fisheries on their own. So if they want to assure their bondholders or their shareholders that they're going to be able to make money by selling fish 10 or 15 years from now, they need to be able to make sure they haven't wiped out the fish in the near term. A large share of the corporate valuation of some of the biggest firms in the country is brand reputation. Retail customers have limited willingness to pay more for low carbon goods, but they do seem to be willing to not buy from a company at all if they think it has a bad reputation. Corporate supply chains, there is $100 trillion that's held by companies that are investors that are participating in the Carbon Disclosure Project called CDP now, that are putting pressure on companies to disclose and reduce their carbon emissions. There is something called the Carbon Principles, which is a group of banks that have gotten together to say if they're going to loan for power plants, they're going to require the power plant to disclose its carbon emissions and have a plan to reduce it. There is, among insurance companies, there was recently an insurance company that said that it will no longer insure coal mines, for example. And you think about the market effect of that, how possible is it to go out and get debt to build a coal mine if you can't get insurance on it? Employee morale matters. Many companies are trying to achieve, to bring in the most talented employees they can and then to retain them. And as we know, a substantial part of the American population does think that climate change is happening. How do you get and keep those employees if your company is inconsistent with that? I also think manager norms matter. I've done some research on this with Sally Simpson at Maryland and Mark Cohen at Vanderbilt, but really hard to prove how much manager norms drive behavior. And so I think it matters, but again, we don't try to rely on that in the work we do. So some things that we could all do. So one thing I think is just there's to me insufficient research trying to tease out how these different and maybe other factors influence corporate behavior as it relates to carbon emissions. I think there's opportunity there. It's critically important. I think we can do more on that. Another area, the efficiency gap. If you ask McKinsey and others, they would say there are several billion tons of carbon emissions reductions available just from investments that would have a positive return for the party doing the investment. If you ask economists, they would say, no, we see all kinds of problems with that research. What I don't ever see is the two sitting down together. And I think there's a huge opportunity there to do something. I'm trying to get the National Academy to convene a workshop where we would get economists and engineers to actually play with each other a little bit and say, all right, McKinsey, you see this opportunity. Economists, what do you see the problem with it? And let's have an iterative process where we try to get from here to some better understanding of what that number might really look like. Another area where I think there's huge opportunity for research, if I were doing some behavioral economics right now, we talk a lot about implicit discount rates, and those implicit discount rates are sometimes incredibly steep, but we rarely look behind that to ask, well, what did the party who was asked, what would you pay for a more efficient air conditioner or heater or whatever, what did they know about the return? How well was that return described to them? And I think there's a lot to be done to unpack more on that. Let me give you an example of why we think that even though markets are, for the most part, efficient, there is enormous opportunity here, enough to give us 500 million metric tons, which is half of our total, from corporations. And that is an example being, Richard Branson has committed to major carbon emissions reductions for Virgin Atlantic. They brought in 3 University of Chicago economists to try to figure out how to reduce the emissions from air transport. And what they found is that they had not been giving fuel economy information to their pilots. So if you're an efficient markets theorist, tell me how we could have an airline whose costs are largely driven by fuel, right, through its history having not given its pilots the ability to reduce that cost. And if Virgin Atlantic didn't do it, I suspect many other airlines didn't either. Maybe some of you know more about that. but that suggests to me that there's an opportunity there. So what did they do? They used interventions, including simply giving feedback to the pilots about how they were doing on energy efficiency, and they found major emissions reductions and cost savings by doing that. So could we spread that idea to other airlines? What about trucking companies, right? I've tried to get the trucking companies interested in the idea of let's just reduce your fuel use by giving your drivers better information on that. And so far, no takers, but I think there are examples of where the opportunities are, and lots of research could be done on that. How much do global supply chains matter? Well, if you look, what we've tried to do is just provide a really simple analysis of where the pressures might be on a retailer like a Target or a Walmart that might be pressing them to try to induce carbon emissions reductions from their supply chain. They may turn around and put that pressure on the manufacturers through all the things I've talked about so far, which turn around and put those pressures on suppliers. How strong are these pressures right now? I gave a talk to a major private equity firm recently that has hired a chief sustainability officer from an NGO. Right? Why was I brought in? Because the suppliers of their portfolio companies are getting a lot of pressure. Their portfolio companies are getting a lot of pressure from the buyers, the corporate buyers of their goods, and they're also getting pressure from the investors who are giving them capital to go buy portfolio companies, who are saying, tell us what the carbon footprint is of our investment, and tell us how you're going to reduce that over time. So we're in a really different world than we were in even 5 or 10 years ago when a major private equity firm has a chief sustainability officer from an NGO working inside, and when they're looking for ways to do things like reduce carbon emissions. This can have remarkable effects, and an example is Apple got pushback from its suppliers about reducing the carbon footprint of its suppliers in China. And so, for whatever reason, it felt induced to turn around and provide 2 gigawatts of solar power to its suppliers in China to allow them to provide goods at low carbon to Apple back here in the United States and around the world. So if you're wondering about China, China's often, I have a paper called The China Problem, we can't move because China won't move, et cetera. Here's a place where the global supply chain is changing China's carbon footprint. Is it because any of us will buy a low carbon iPhone? I don't think so. But we might not think about Apple in the first place if we think that they're not a good actor out there. My instinct is that's probably what's going on. So that's the corporate side. Let me say a couple words about the household side. We also think there are 500 million tons available there. The first question there is, do households matter or not? And if you look at the report that was submitted to Congress before the Cap and Trade Bill in 2009, 2008, what you see is that the residential share was attributed as 5% of U.S. carbon emissions. And I'll show you the statement they issued in just a minute, but essentially they said, gee, at 5%, not worth worrying about. Okay? How did they get to 5%? They got to 5% because they excluded all the electricity you use and the carbon emissions associated with the electricity you use and all the carbon emissions associated with all of your transport. Okay? What happens when you include that? Now the household share is 1/3 to 40% of the U.S. total, depending on whose analysis you look at. Now it looks like something we might think about. And what's really important in this regulatory climate is now some of the interventions that we could use with households are still viable because they're often informational, they're non-intrusive, they're non-regulatory, they're things we can actually do if we're smart about it. But if we think about it as just the power plant and the auto manufacturer, now we're locked into a regulatory framework which might not have the political feasibility that some of us might want. Another problem that we face, and this is an area where I think a lot more good work could be done, I have a paper in the Columbia Law Review with Kevin Stack, who's an administrative law scholar, and we looked at what we called the 1% problem, which is that we all have this intuition that something at 1% or less doesn't matter. In law, we say de minimis non curat lex, which I'm sure you guys say all the time too. Yeah. The law doesn't concern itself with trivial things, and we think of 1% or less as trivial. Right? But if you take away all those countries that contribute 1% or less to the global total carbon emissions, you've reduced the total down to about 12 or so from 190. Right? If you look at U.S. industrial sectors, almost every one of them can claim, with some exceptions, we're down in the 1% range or so once you figure out what the denominator is in the right way. Okay? So we need to worry a little bit more in some cases about getting over this 1% bias we have, particularly as to households. And so what we did in this earlier paper was just to try to look at the technical potential and the behavioral plasticity of 16 behavior types as they relate to energy use and carbon emissions, and come up with a reasonably achievable emissions reductions even with non-intrusive, non-regulatory mechanisms. And we found that the total that we thought was achievable in a decade was a 20% reduction in the household share. How big was that 20% reduction? It was equal to all the carbon emissions of France. Why is that true? It's because the household share, as I mentioned before, is equal to all of the countries of South America. So even a small reduction in the household share really matters. And notice, if you're a social scientist, what I keep doing, which is to keep coming back to benchmarks against which we can measure whether these reductions matter or not. I was the one in this paper who suggested that we mention that that's equal to all the carbon emissions of France, and got a lot of pushback on that, won that battle, and it's now one of the most quoted of the statements we made in that article. People are looking for some sense of grounding if what you want to do is do work that affects policy. So again, one of my thoughts here for social scientists is go out on a limb and figure out how you make the argument that what you're doing matters, even if it's only in a couple of sentences. And work on things that matter. Why bother working on something where the technical potential, the behavioral plasticity, and the initiative feasibility are so low, unless there's some deeper theoretical reason, in which case I'm all in favor of it. So you all know about many of these kind of feedbacks that are available. We talk a lot about monthly feedback, which O-Power kind of examples have produced persistent 1 to 2% reductions from households. I think immediate feedback is an area understudied. 5 to 15% emissions reductions have been found. If you can very easily get feedback right in front of you and don't have to take a lot of steps to get it, that's a real area for study. We did a study and we found that 80% of Americans think that you should idle your car for an extended period of time if you want to reduce cost to yourself and pollution, and the recommended time is 10 to 30 seconds. The difference, if all Americans did what was only in their own self-interest, would be 600 million gallons of gas a year, or the equivalent of 2 or 3 major industrial sectors, if we could just give people information and they would act on it in their own interest in terms of idling their cars. By the way, the same, these are the different sectors that it would be equal to, and a couple of countries. Hand washing, it's flu season. How many of you think the hotter the water, the cleaner the hands in terms of avoiding pathogen transmission for flu? You know me asking, I'm only asking for a reason. Of course, the answer is there isn't any literature that supports the idea that hotter water makes hands cleaner, unless you want to boil your hands. If you want to do that, you're in a different league from me. That's equal to 1 million tons of carbon a year, of carbon dioxide a year, in terms of the amount of energy and carbon emissions associated with heating water that's being used in places where people are trying to get water that's more than comfortable. You do want to wash your hands and wash them a lot. You just don't need super hot water to do it. I think Shazeen Attari, who does really good work, found that people underestimate by 40 times how much energy their clothes dryer uses. So again, that's going to influence your behavior. I think working in the myth area and how we bust myths is really important. Here's what the House Commerce Committee said. In the household area, one of the biggest things we worry about is what I think of as the problem of scale, which is many of the best interventions are ones that have to be closely tailored, and yet if we want to get to sufficient emissions reductions, we need to have very widespread effects. And that's essentially what the House Commerce Committee said. I showed the pie chart before. They said it would just be a big administrative burden to try to scale up interventions on the household level. But there are ways to do that, and those of you in business school, I think, are particularly in a good position to do this. We have work that we're doing right now based on a grant we received looking at the different ways in which companies are offering employees energy benefits that are effective at home. So if you work at some big companies, they will give you money to do an energy audit of your home energy use, or to put on a home solar system, or to do other things like that. And if you think about it, if Walmart has how many employees? 1.5 million or something like that. We can help beat the problem of scale. How many does Penn State have? 17,000. 17,000. That's just here, right? Yeah. How about around the state?
Probably about 23,000.
Okay, so if you change the efficiency behavior of your employees, they may also change their efficiency behavior at work, and you can certainly have a big effect on their footprint. So we can beat the problem of scale if we think about it in a sophisticated way. So let me go, I'm running out of time, but let me do a couple of last things. All of this wouldn't make sense if changing one behavior to the good produces a second behavior to the bad, and particularly if that second behavior is worse than the first behavior. Do we have some economists here? What are you guys anyway? So here's the thing, think about what are the things economists talk about spillover, as I call it. They talk about rebound, backfire, the Jevons effect. All those are features where I induce you to do one thing good and you did a second thing bad. Right? So bad from my perspective in terms of carbon emissions. I make your air conditioner more efficient, you have more money, you go run it longer. Or whatever it might be. And when we started with a research group looking at this question, we said, well, where is the positive effect on this? Is there a possible positive effect? And we've tried to use the term, we're not coining it, but use the term and promote the term spillover effect rather than rebound or backfire or something like that. So it's a neutral term because there could be positive or negative spillover effects. And if you look at the psych literature, you find the virtuous escalator, you find various identity effects, you find reasons to believe, you also find moral licensing, various reasons why it could be positive or negative when you induce someone to do one good thing, what they do with the next thing. And so the idea might be if I push you to do pro-environmental behavior 1, how likely is it that you'll do pro-environmental behavior 2? And if there's positive spillover, you're going to do more of that. If there's negative, you're going to do less, and it might be no spillover whatsoever. And so we have received a grant, a group of us, Elke Weber from Princeton, Caitlin Ramey Toner at Michigan, and me, and Heather Barnes-Truelove, who's at University of North Florida, and we've been researching this issue quite a bit. And what we've done is tried to make sure that people understand that there are reasons to believe both that spillover could be positive, but also negative. And not simply to answer that question directly, but to make sure that researchers are trying to in a more balanced way understand about spillover. And we could spend a week just talking about the one chart. The simple answer is it's not been as simple as we had hoped to try to understand that, but I think we're getting a better sense that I think will help program designers think about what kind of first intervention do I want to use if I want to avoid the risk of a negative second effect, or if I want to have the most positive net effect after we consider second and third behaviors. And I think we're learning something about that we could talk more about. So I'll wrap up with one last question, which is, what do we mean by justice? I taught a class on climate justice in the spring. We hear a lot about climate justice. And I want to talk about intergenerational and framing issues. And I think most of us think about justice in the first instance when it comes to climate by thinking about disparities in wealth around the world and who will pay more for high-cost energy if we switch to a low-carbon future, as well as who will be most harmed. Particularly folks working on the left focus almost exclusively on these issues. And what we're trying to do in the book is open people's minds a little bit to a second issue. This is from an earlier IPCC report. Even if we level off carbon emissions in the very near future, sea level is still going to be rising well over 1,000 years from now. Right? A significant proportion of all the carbon we release today will still be in the air 10,000 years from now. And so the equity or justice question, although we're all focused on who's going to pay and be harmed here, right, is also going to affect, if it's 10,000 years, 500 generations of people in the future. So we tend to focus on equity or justice, but what we're really talking about is intra-generational equity or justice. Those of us in this room and maybe our first level offspring. But from my perspective, I'm interested in this. I put this together for a class. It didn't go over very well. Let me see what you guys think of it. Every one of these emojis is 1 billion people at some point in the future. Okay? So if climate change gets to the point where it affects the future for 10,000 years, which there's a real possibility there, then this is 500 generations. That'll be 500 generations in a standard way to think of a generation. And these are 7 billion. I've put some happy faces in there. And this is based on the Chakravarty and Sokolow work, if you know about it, which says that among all the people in the world, the billion wealthiest produce the most carbon emissions, and we just simply said, well, they maybe will be least affected, but most people will be harmed in the future. So the problem is when we're thinking about climate justice, we shouldn't just be thinking about how do we affect people today, but how do we affect people in the future. And I said this didn't go over well in my class. I was unable to get the students in my class to list future generations as one of the top 15 things that they worry about. Maybe there's a deeper evolutionary thing there. I don't know what's going on there. But we have a really hard time worrying about people in the deep future. Even if we have a big heart or a strong sense of equity or justice. I'm a little bit different. I don't know why. But I'm as worried about somebody 100 generations from now or 10 generations from now as I'm worried about someone today. I think people will look back from the future and say, what did you do? You just committed me to a sea level of 20 feet higher. What were you thinking? And my answer being, oh, I was worried about somebody today, won't, I think, be that happy, particularly because it's the people who are least advantaged today whose offspring in the future will be the least advantaged in the future. One answer to that climate justice offers is situations like this. There can be ways out of it. I showed this before, but when people in China might have been pushing back saying, hey, we don't have the resources to meet your carbon goals, Apple, Apple was induced to provide resources back the other way. So we can try to build justice concerns into private governance responses too. And I'm going to get to one last thing, which is this, and I'll wrap up with this, which is, do people care about the future? We asked people, if you had $100, how much of that $100 would you spend on your reputation today versus your reputation in the future? And why is that? Because we see this as sort of a socio-temporal trap. In other words, ordinarily our behavior is regulated in part by our own moral norms, but also by what we think others will think of us. But a generation 100 in the future will have no idea what any of us in this room did. Right? So we're not regulated at all in terms of the social norms of those in the future unless we care about our reputation. And so we tried to find out, if you had $100, how much would you put to your reputation in your lifetime versus after you die? And what we found is people said roughly $40 they would attribute to buying a better reputation after you die. And so we took away from that the idea that people do care, not more than they do about their current lifetime, but they do care about their reputation. Then you have the problem of how do you secure a better reputation in the future? And our argument is that a private response could allow us to all individually on our own record data today about what we believe and what we're doing about climate. And then we could store that data so that future generations could access it. So people would know that Janet Swim did the right thing in what she researched and what her carbon footprint was, and her great-great-great-grandchildren would know that, and she would know in her lifetime that they would know that. And so we asked some data scientists, what's the best electronic form to preserve data so you know it will be still available in 100 years or more? And you know what they said? Print it out. Print it out. Yeah, print it out. In other words, just abandon that idea. But anyway, so we've proposed a legacy registry, which again a private institution could do, but public could not. Well, I've gone over, but those are the kind of things we're trying to float in this book, and I could talk about a lot more, but I'd like to get some questions for anybody who would like to stay.
Why don't you, thank you. I think we'll go ahead and stop here, and those who want to talk further, Mike will be here, and we'll talk on one-to-one or in small groups.
Or if anybody wants to raise a question, again, feel free to leave if you'd like to.
Yeah, let's thank him again. Thank you.
Yes, go ahead.
So there are some natural scientists in the room.
Yep.
What do you want us to do?
Number one, worry about your own carbon footprint, so when you do really good work, it doesn't get undermined when people read about it. Number two, focus on the things that you study that might match up with some of the social scientists, perhaps. There are times when, and here's just an example. We just spent $100 billion on climate relief, right? I'm trying to figure out if we had spent that money instead to decarbonize the electric grid, how many of those plants could we have actually bought out? And I'm having trouble finding somebody who has those numbers. Now, that's not natural science, that's more economics and energy policy. But I think one good answer is work in these interdisciplinary teams, and your perspective is incredibly valuable and often deeply disconnected from what the social scientists are doing. We studied, for example, in the spillover grant, we studied glass bottle spillover effects, and if I had been thinking at the time, we would have studied aluminum can spillover effects, because it would have mattered more on some level. I just wasn't thinking policy at the time we designed the experiment. And I think if you bring your expertise to the table, it will either be in your own deep area of expertise, or the fact that you are a natural scientist will help the other teams think differently. So I would go out of my way, number one, to act consistent with what I believe, and number two, to seek out interdisciplinary teams to work with, and number three, work with them to find areas where your research will actually move the dial somewhat.
Any other questions?
Yes.
What would be maybe one or two of the most effective pushes for private aspects getting towards climate?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think the most important overall step is to get the philanthropic community and the managers of major corporations and environmental groups to realize what the opportunity is here. If I could say there's one thing we're trying to do with this book, it's to make that conceptual shift so people don't just say, what can government do? But instead, what we're seeing in a lot of cases is one-off things in lots of different places and lots of missed opportunities. I think, for example, if I were Bill Gates right now, there was a period, 18 months ago, where, what is Bill Gates worth, $90 billion? He could have, for several $billion, bought the American coal industry and helped put it on a little bit of a different glide path, for example. I think right now, one area I would focus on is taking the pressure that the Carbon Disclosure Project puts on firms, and they're sitting on $100 trillion, and work very hard to focus on what are called Scope 3 emissions, which means that a company reports not just its emissions, but the emissions that come from its supply chain. Because what's happening now is, like in the study that I did of corporate supply chain contracting, it was clearly the largest firms that were doing the most of it. And the difficulty is pushing down into the middle-sized and smaller firms and pushing outside of the global north into companies around the world. So I would be pushing hard to get CDP and others to have the ability to induce more companies to disclose their Scope 3 emissions on the theory that when they do that, they'll have more incentives to push their suppliers. And when we do that, we can actually extend the influence of this whole area in a very dramatic way. So that would be something. On a personal level, if anybody's thinking just what do I do as a person, how efficient is your car? How weatherized is your home? How efficient are your appliances? Then worry about lighting, even though it's having this big effect. That's the order of things I would probably do. First my car, then my home weatherization, then my heating and cooling system, and then I would start looking at more small investments.
In terms of green energy producers versus the regular, that should be an advantage.
Yes, absolutely. And again, in the Southeast, I'm working with Vanderbilt to try to get Vanderbilt interested in their nibbling on buying its power, buying renewable power. And what we're finding is that it is remarkably cost competitive right now. Wind in particular, next solar, but that some big institutions could very likely buy all the power they're buying now at less cost than they're now buying it if they were to contract for 100% renewable energy. So there's literally not a financial penalty to be paid in some markets, which is a totally different thing from 5 or 10 years ago. Yes?
So the mechanism you're proposing for, I forget what you called it, where the larger companies require actions from their suppliers.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It seems to me that you get the same pushback about having a negative effect on commerce, right, on industry, because those smaller suppliers have less resilience than the big companies. And so another thing you showed at the beginning of this was the relative size of the tax code versus the environmental code.
Mm-hmm.
But the tax code is, in large measure, trying to frame the whole structure of society through incentives and penalties. So it seems to me that combining those two, in other words, giving breaks to achieve what you're asking these manufacturers to achieve from their suppliers, is all part of a public-private partnership.
Yeah, and I have overstressed the private side just to make that point, but I think a lot of these are hybrid activities. On the tax code, there's a great paper, if anybody's interested in renewable power subsidies versus fossil fuel power subsidies, Tracy Roberts has a paper in the Columbia Environmental Law Journal where she's a very good environmental tax lawyer, actually, and she tries to tease out what those have been over time. And so I think that's an area of incredible importance. So yes, absolutely. As to whether it's sort of problematic that you might see manufacturers putting pressure on suppliers, if they're pushing for greater efficiency and greater carbon emissions reductions,
You still have to get there from here.
you have to get there from here, but you know what? If we don't do that, we get a couple thousand years of climate change. So I'm okay with that. I'll live with that. Yeah, I'll just live with that.
If you're a small business owner, you may not.
That's right. You may go out of business, and we have to all decide. I don't think that's. I don't think we can go ha-ha, right? We have to say we have a moral obligation. I think the same is true if we displace fossil fuels. Like there's a great picture of of Times Square in 1900, and it's completely full of horse-drawn traffic. Then there's the same picture from 1913, and you don't see a horse in the picture, right? That was an incredible displacement. Yet we wouldn't expect the government to have stepped in and prevented the development of the American automobile. But we should worry about the displacement of the people who were dealing with horses at the time, I think. So I think for a small business owner, if you're getting pressure from Walmart to reduce fewer toxics, or from Apple to reduce your carbon emissions, I'm sympathetic. But I'd rather you get that pressure. The choice is not that pressure versus nothing. It's that pressure from Apple or Walmart versus government, or allowing catastrophic climate change to have a substantial risk in the future. And I'll make that trade-off.
Or having government step in and help mitigate the
Well, right.
carriage fee.
And I'm good with that too. I'm totally good with that. And or even inducing.
Manufacturers stepping in.
That's right, or trying to put pressure on the companies to worry about it. What I worry about, though, a little bit is if you look at these standards, for many of these certification and standard systems, when you include climate with 8 or 10 other things, because I think of this problem here, sorry, this makes it a little slow when I got all these little features in this. This problem here, we tend to focus completely on how is it going to affect the people today. And I think we need to worry about the people today, but we can't forget all these guys. And I think we have a tendency to worry about what's right in front of our face. And whatever we do, it has to be subject to a constraint to get to a pathway where we don't create 500 generations worth of harm, I think. So I'm sympathetic. I think we need to push hard to deal with displaced workers and businesses, and I think we can do that. But I think all of that has to be done subject to, I wouldn't get on an airplane if somebody said, hey, you know, there's a 1 in 20 chance that the plane's going to crash. I don't think anybody in this room would. I don't know, there are natural scientists here. What's the chance that we have a catastrophic future on the current pathway that we're on? Yeah.
I just, it's interesting because, and Terry can probably chime in on this too, we've been trying to kind of sift out the research even just in Smeal. And this speaks to your point with respect to the external elements that you can influence to influence this.
Mhm.
And more specifically, we have a faculty member that did a piece of research on does the ultimate project, mountaintop mining,
Yeah.
affect the banks that are loaning to these companies
Right.
doing mountaintop
Right,
mining?
right.
And if I'm not mistaken, the results of the research were, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Because it may not be Bank of America or Merrill Lynch.
Right.
But at some tier,
Yeah.
there's a bank willing to loan.
Yeah.
and all other things equal.
That's right.
At the time he did the research, I believe.
That's right,
there
that's
was
right.
significant unemployment.
That's right.
So at some level, and it was done in
Yeah.
the mountaintop mining was done in West
Yeah.
Virginia. So if you look at all the pieces together.
Right.
It may not be Bank of America and Merrill Lynch.
Right.
But there are banks and probably
Sure.
PNC, I believe,
Sure.
they're funding.
Sure, absolutely. And I think in some areas, this is like the research that's been done on divestiture, right? Which suggests that it's sort of hard to see that the divestiture movement actually influenced the share price of firms. But I don't think that's so I think that's true in some areas, but I think, if you're the head of investment in some area, you kind of wouldn't rather have to do business with the next tier of bank, right? They're going to charge you a little more, they're going to give you different terms, so it's going to affect your cost of capital a little bit or the ease with which you can do your business. I think also that NGOs are getting smarter and smarter and going down the food chain, so that today you can get let's say the equator principles for project finance. Okay, so project finance, you use essentially the returns on the investment to fund the project itself, being used to build dams and pipelines and bridges and things around the world. 90% plus of the capital going into project finance around the world is by banks that have signed on to the Equator Principles. And the Equator Principles effectively are like a NEPA, if you know the National Environmental Policy Act. It requires an environmental assessment before you do the project and some effort, not necessarily successful, to reduce the environmental impact. So does that mean that 10% of the private project finance equity that's out there is not signed on to those principles? Yeah, absolutely. But Many of the major developers don't want to have to go to that bank, and it affects them. So I think that absolutely there are areas where the availability of other capital doesn't care about this. The same I've heard a lot about Brazilian beef and deforestation, that there's an entire agreement between major European food and leather companies and the Brazilian slaughterhouses to reduce the deforestation. So the slaughterhouses committed in a private set of agreements to reduce the deforestation associated with the beef that they buy. They won't buy beef unless it's essentially certified, for lack of a better term, to have come from a forest, an area that wasn't recently deforested. Okay? And so why is that happening? Well, probably if you're Adidas or Nike or McDonald's, you're not going to be able to sell to a German or Danish customer unless they feel confident that you're not contributing to deforestation in Brazil. And there's some suggestion that nevertheless there's enough other of a market for that beef anyway. It's not clear how much of an effect that's had. So I think that's a real issue in many areas. I don't think it's enough of an issue to undermine. It's enough for us to only claim 500 million tons of CO2 emissions reductions a year. If we didn't have some of those phenomena, I'd be making a more aggressive claim. I would also say there's a really interesting moral question that gets raised that we don't typically talk about on this justice front, which is it okay for a Danish consumer to insist on palm oil that comes from a non-recently deforested forest in Sumatra? Right? What if that costs the job of a Sumatran forester? Okay, and that's a challenge. And I've been accused of being a neoliberal neo-colonialist because I'm so worried about these guys here, the 500 generations, that I think it's okay for a consumer in Japan or China or wherever they might be to insist on a product that's going to reduce the risk of climate change, even if that has some coercive effect on the person supplying it. And a lot of people working in this area are not willing to do that. So I've just put that on the table. I'm worried enough about climate that I actually think I'm making the more moral choice, because I think that person is responding to their emotive intuition about this person today and is ignoring the 500 generations of descendants of this person today. I hope often, though, we won't get in the choice of having to make that choice. I hope we get in that Apple situation where they provide the capital to let it happen in the first place. Yes?
I'm not sure exactly how to phrase this question, but have been very interested in carbon tax. And is what you're actually saying there is that the carbon tax actually filters through the private sector and changes the price of goods?
Okay. Okay. So well, not exactly, but close. Yeah. So in the book, what we say basically is we think of everything we're doing as a second best approach. We think that a global carbon tax set at the right level would be the best answer. It would be the cheapest way to go about this, and you could adjust for some justice issues and other things. But we think that it is a mistake to put all your eggs in the first best option if the first best option is not feasible in the near term, given that climate is something where we could pass thresholds at any given time where it might get much more expensive to go backward if we ever could. And so we say throughout the book that we think that a carbon price is the best answer if we could get there. But then we say, assuming we can't get there right away, and I think that's even more of a good assumption than it was several years ago when we started on this, then we say these are other options. Now, I think what's interesting about what we talk about, though, is we talk a lot about trying to make sure that these would be complementary to a carbon tax if one were adopted. An example would be, think about the idling problem. If gasoline is twice as expensive and people think they save gas by idling for 3.5 minutes, are they going to idle more or less? Right? They're going to idle more. So an initiative that tries to correct myths about idling's effects on gas use is actually going to be to accelerate or accentuate the benefits of a carbon tax. It's going to allow consumers to act in the way you would want them to when you've priced energy at a level that reflects the carbon emissions. So what we're trying to do is, and we try to identify when we can, options that appear to be complementary rather than ones that would become barriers to the better public response in the long run. We're just not willing to wait to let that happen. The other thing I would say is one reason very likely why the early years of a carbon tax are often thought to be quite low cost is that there is a lot of this inefficiency out there. And now there's a huge debate about that. And until I got into that literature, I just didn't realize how, I think, little engagement there is between those who are optimistic about the size of the inefficiencies out there and those who are pessimistic. And I think what we've suggested, for example, it took looking for the carbon footprint by Walker's Crisps to realize that they're buying potatoes by the pound. And when they buy them by the pound, in England, the farmers pick the potatoes when they're wet, and then they have to transport heavy potatoes, and then they humidify their warehouses to keep them wet so they get more money per pound of potato. Okay, and then Walker's Crisp has to dry the potato to make a potato chip. Okay, but it took a carbon focus for them to find that pricing scheme that had been there forever. I don't know what the origins of it are. I think one of the things a carbon tax would do is induce companies, individuals, to begin to be more sensitive to their energy use, and then to go find those efficiencies that are out there. And that helps bring the cost of a carbon tax down. And I think a lot of what we're doing is essentially taking that first step out so that when we do get a carbon tax, we will have already found some of the efficiencies that a tax would have otherwise induced us to find.
So the question is,
Yeah.
is when Walmart has this impact, are they raising the prices or are they keeping them low?
You know, if anything, you know, what they're doing, again, and it causes some, you know, real genuine justice concerns, but they're using the ability to get carbon emissions reductions as a surrogate for the ability to find energy efficiency savings, as a way to say to their suppliers, you know, we want you to sell us the same thing for the same price at half the carbon. And so they're using it as a way to push their suppliers, again, you know, for good and worse, to reduce their energy use, for example. And there are lots of examples that you've probably heard of. They were shipping detergent across the Pacific. They had to convince consumers that concentrated detergent is just as good as non-concentrated detergent, because they found that, 40% of all the detergent in big ships coming across the Pacific was water. And it was water because consumers wanted a lot of volume. They associated volume with value. And so they first have to convince the consumer small and concentrated is the same. And once they do that, then they can tell their supplier, we're going to pay you a lot less because of the less shipping that you need to do. Here's another example, though. Again, if you're in business, I'd love to talk to you. If you're in a business school, in the shipping industry, my understanding is roughly 2/3 of the cost of shipping a good is borne by the party shipping the good under traditional fee arrangements, whereas the ship owner pays 1/3 of the fuel costs. And as a result, you know, the ship owner, who's in the best position to actually reduce fuel use, is the one who has a muted incentive to actually reduce fuel use. So again, here's another place where there's a traditional pricing scheme that creates this sort of principal agent problem or a market failure, and that in turn, I think, is something that we'd like to call attention to. I think a carbon tax would do that too if it were adopted.
Why don't we
Yeah.
stop here?
Go ahead. Yeah.
I just want to make
Yeah.
one quick comment.
Yes, please.
First, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And second is, just look to Car Talk for the answer on the item.
Yeah. We cite Car Talk in our book. Yeah. Well, I'll tell you one thing. Be careful about radio things, because there's a radio program in New York that called the hand washing thing bullshit. Not having read our thing, they literally gave it the word, they call everything good or bullshit or whatever, and they called it bullshit, and they were wrong. And they just sort of decided that. But the Car Talk guys are exactly right. We literally quote them in our book. So I appreciate the advice. I totally agree with you.
Okay, we'll stop here. Michael will be around
Thank you.
if you'd like to ask questions one-on-one up front. And thanks again for attending.
Good, thanks. Great questions. These were terrific.